Well, good morning and welcome. Today's session will be recorded and available on the FNSB Community Research Quarterly website. If you have any questions throughout the session, please use the raise your hand feature. I would like to introduce you to today's moderator, Dan Robinson. He's the Research Chief with Alaska Department of Labor and Workforce Development Research and Analysis. Dan, please begin the session.
Thanks, Stephanie. I want to just briefly introduce who we are at Research and Analysis. I hope that some of you are familiar with us through our monthly economic magazine, Alaska Economic Trends. We use that to try to, we try really hard to make important data elements, points, insights clear to smart non-specialists. So we're talking to people who are interested, but in a way that we hope is clear and understandable. And backing up even just a little bit from there, what we do that I hope is relevant to a session like today and in general when you hear from Research Analysis is the bulk of our work is in producing these data sets. So primarily jobs, population, estimates and projections in both cases, unemployment rates, some of the key economic data sets that often in combination with our federal partners, whether it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Census Bureau, we produce these numbers. So we understand a little bit when small changes mean something and when they don't. But as you're hearing lots of people talk about the economy, especially jobs and population numbers, listen to them. So a lot of them are very smart and have very good insights, whether they're academic people or economic journalists. But I just wanted to emphasize at the outset that this data production task that we have, I think, gives us some unique insight into the data. So getting started now, we have a good chunk of time, and we started out with 10 questions. And if you do have a paper and pen handy and you want to take a test, remember back when you were a student, feel free. But we have 9 true/false questions that we're going to start with. So see how you do. Number 1, and I'll start, and we're gonna take turns. Liz Brooks, I'll introduce. She works with Eric Sandberg and David Howell on our 3-person population census demographics team, and I'm the research chief here. So we'll take turns. First question: true or false? And like Stephanie said, raise your hand if you have any questions. I don't see on my screen the hand raised thing, so Stephanie will jump in if there's a question, especially as we go. Ask questions if there's anything about the chart or table that you don't understand, and then we'll definitely leave some time at the end for some more general questions if there are topics you think we might have some answers for that we haven't covered. So true or false? Alaska and Fairbanks have not yet recovered all their COVID-related job losses. I've given you a few seconds to mark your answer or even just mentally say what you think. My guess is this one's fairly easy. The answer to that is true. And we're going to look at a few charts, starting with this one. This is Alaska as a whole. And what you see here is from January 2015 through roughly the present. I think there's one more month that I could have added here. And this is seasonally adjusted, so don't get too hung up on that. I chose that for the shape, but so the shape is what's important here. What you see, among other things, is that Alaska was not doing terribly well pre-COVID. So you see January 2015 to about late 2018, early 2019, we were losing jobs. Then we were just starting to grow again when COVID hit. You see a little bit of a bounce, and then a little bit of a stagnating recovery, although don't read too much into that. But so that's Alaska as a whole. Looking at specifically at Fairbanks, and this don't read a lot into those ups and downs. There's some volatility and some behind the scenes data reasons for that, but just focus on the broad shape. And you see roughly the same thing here. you see that Fairbanks wasn't adding jobs over that 15 to 18 period, just starting to grow again. COVID hits, big, historically big job losses. And then we see the recovery and basically the same thing in terms of not really clear that we're still recovering strongly at the moment. And even though these data are seasonally adjusted, seasonal factors play a role here. So again, just focus on the broad shape primarily. And then lastly, I wanted to just, for comparison, before we move to the next question, show you what US jobs over the same period look like. And here you see a fairly strong job market pre-COVID, steady growth, and then COVID hits, just like in Alaska, and every single state had the same basic pattern of COVID, those very big job losses, strong initial bounce, and then US has recovered more, a higher percentage of the jobs lost than Alaska has, but still has a ways to go to get back to where we were pre-COVID. So that's question number one. And I will pause just for a second in case there are any clarifying questions about that specifically before we jump to the next question. And I'll put the next question up. And hearing nothing, and actually we won't pause anymore. I'll just wait for somebody to jump in. Stephanie will monitor hand raising, and then otherwise, if you have a question at the end. I do see a hand, but I'm not sure. Susan. Yes, Susan, let's hear it.
Oh,
maybe that was a Susan. There we go.
I said false.
We may be having some audio difficulty. It looks like you want to try one more time, Susan, before we jump ahead?
Sure. Can you hear me now? Oh, wait a minute. Can you hear me? Whoops. Can you hear me now?
Just barely. Go ahead.
False.
Okay, we're muted again. Susan, we'll come back to you. And I think we'll do this again, unless it's a clarifying question, until the end. We'll have time at the end for some more questions. So let's go to question number 2. And Eric Sandberg is going to lead us here. True or false, the population of the Fairbanks North Star Borough has grown since 2010. And I will jump to the answer. That's false. And Eric, take it away from here.
All right. Thank you, Dan. As Dan mentioned, the question was if the Fairbanks North Star Borough had grown since 2010, and the answer is false. You can see on this map has the boroughs in green that have grown in population between the 2010 census and the 2020 census, and the boroughs in purple shrank between the 2010 census and the 2020 census. And I also put the numbers for Fairbanks North Star Borough on the right side. So in 2010, there were 97,500 people counted in the borough. In the 2010 census, in 2020, that drops to 95,655, which is a drop of about 1,900 people, which out of any the boroughs is the largest total population drop of any borough or census area. But the map shows percentage change, and Fairbanks's percentage change was quite low. I think it's about 1% or so, but you can see the regional pattern. All of the interior boroughs and census areas dropped in population, along with Anchorage, parts of Bristol Bay, Kodiak, and Sitka and Prince of Wales Hyder. And on the opposite end, between 2010 and 2020, about half the boroughs and census areas gained population. This was led by the Mat-Su Borough, which gained about 18,000 people in that time, which was accounted for about 3/4 of the state's total growth, which Alaska only grew about 23,000 people between 2010 and 2020. But Matsu's growth rate, even though it was above 20%, was still, they lost their fastest growing borough tag that went to Skagway, which grew by 28%, although the population is much smaller in Skagway, obviously. And then next slide, Dan. So within the Fairbanks borough, which areas grew and shrank? So same color scheme, but now this is total population growth or loss between the 2010 census and the 2020 census by block group for all the various block groups within the Fairbanks North Star Borough. Block group is just a small statistical unit of about 600 to 1,000 people. And what stands out for growth was Fort Wainwright, which grew by about 1,600 people. That was, we think, largely because they changed how deployed overseas military was counted in the 2020 census compared to the 2010 census, which helped Fort Wainwright some. In 2010, if a soldier from Fort Wainwright was deployed, they would be counted as the overseas population of the state they enlisted in, whereas in the 2020 census, a soldier deployed overseas from stationed at Fort Wainwright would be counted still at Fort Wainwright, and also there were probably fewer deployments in 2020 than 2010. So that helped the population of the city of Fairbanks, outlined in the yellow, because the civilian portions of the city of Fairbanks mostly lost population, especially the downtown core and parts of areas south of Airport Way. And for other areas that gained population in the Fairbanks North Star Borough between 2010 and 2020, that included Badger, much of Badger, the city of North Pole, parts of Chino Ridge, and parts of Farmers Loop and Steel Creek. But when you look at the purple areas, which lost population between the 2010 and 2020 census, what stands out, of course, is Eielson in the east, which we think the 2020 census occurred. It was a count of April 1st, 2020, so it might have occurred too early to pick up much of the incoming F-35s. There was loss in some of the outer areas, Two Rivers, Fox, Goldstream. But what stands out most is the UAF campus over there, where the College Place Point, which in the 2020 census, the UAF campus reported 500 kids in the dorm versus 1,500 were reported in 2010. And this is likely due to COVID issues. The 2020 census, if you recall, occurred in April, but kids were sent home from colleges in March of 2020 mostly, and they were the census was supposed to count anyone who would have been there in April, but there have been issues with undercounts at various college towns around the country, and it seems possibly Fairbanks too. So, yeah, I'm done, Dan.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Eric. So next question over to Liz Brooks.
So you might be wondering whether migration in and out of Fairbanks is trending up or down. So what do you think? This is true or false? Is the migration in and out of Fairbanks trending down? Yes, that's true. And on the next slide, there is a chart of average annual migration for 5-year periods in and out of Fairbanks North Star Borough. So we have this data going back to the mid-90s. And the blue line is out-migration, average annual out-migration, and the yellow bars is average annual in-migration. So you can see that it appears average annual out-migration is generally trending down, but still within its typical range. But what really stands out is in-migration and how that has trended down over time. And we see a similar pattern for Alaska overall.
And Liz, I'll just jump in to say Alaska is interesting because we are pretty consistently the most migratory state in the country. And over this period, I think, again, maybe a year or two, we weren't number one. And we are interesting compared to some states. We have a strong pull and a strong push. Some states, Nevada, Florida, Nevada in particular, have had a lot of migration, but it's been mostly in. Alaska historically has especially large in and out migration flows. People are dying to live here for a while, and then some of them can't stand the heat, can't stand the non-heat, and off they go. So migration is a big part of what drives Alaska's economy, and we are familiar with some of the big booms and kind of give backs, busts. I don't know, some of them are busts, some of them not. But moving to question number 4, despite all the job losses, there are an unusually large number of job openings. And a little context for this, you would normally expect, and historically you see in state and local and national economies, when you've had a period of job loss, usually there aren't very many job openings. People are hungry to get back to, and into the jobs that are available when they become available. And I wanted to mention, so Fairbanks, this is helpful, I hope, in thinking about the jobs that you are still missing from a few years ago, from pre-COVID. So leisure and hospitality is a category that includes restaurants, bars, also gyms, theaters. It's still down 700 jobs from a couple of years ago. Retail trade is down a couple of hundred jobs. Government, interestingly, is down 500 jobs from 2 years ago. 300 of that in local, 200 of that in state government. But some other categories that are pretty important are not down. You have recovered all of the lost jobs. So professional and business services, for example, those are fairly high wage, high training required jobs. You're up 100 from 2 years ago. Construction, you're flat. Healthcare is flat. Financial activities, that's refinancing, banking, credit card stuff, mostly banking, you're up 100. So the types of jobs that are still missing are pretty important. And that's a little bit of background to this question. Does that make sense to you, that there would be a large number of job openings despite losing all those jobs? You probably know the answer to this one too, because it's been covered extensively in the media for good reason. True. And here's a data set that shows for all of Alaska the number of job openings. And a job opening, it sounds obvious, but it's part of what we like about this, and it's a new data set, and we wrote about it in this month's issue of Trends that just came out yesterday, if you're curious. But a job opening, it can mean different things to different people. But this data set does a good job of saying an employer's actively looking. They don't just have an open spot in their org chart. They're actively trying to fill a position that they would hire for if the right applicant walked in the door. And what this line graph shows is how unusually high the number of job openings are in Alaska. You see the big COVID plunge again in early 2020, a nice recovery, and some of that up and down at the very far right of the graph is is almost certainly data noise, but we are believers, for I think good reason, that this data and other, nothing as data specific as this, but there are a lot of open positions at employers in Alaska and throughout the country. And interestingly, it's a bigger problem in the US than in other countries for some interesting reasons. But employers are having a hard time filling open positions. This is very true. So that next question, and you get one, I was thinking you get 1 point for signing your name. So you're already ahead again to 9 questions. Moving on to question number 5. And for this, we're going to go back to Eric.
All right, yes, the question is, is the Fairbanks North Star Borough still the second largest in Alaska, second largest borough? And that is false. Next slide. So this chart shows the top 5 boroughs by population from 1970 through 2020. And typically we've thought of Anchorage and Fairbanks as 1, 2 in population. This dates back to World War II, even before there was a state and before there were boroughs, that the Anchorage area and the Fairbanks area, when the growth of the military bases in World War II became the first and second largest areas of state. And after statehood, when things are formalized into boroughs, 1970 was the first census that included borough counts as population. They were number 2 by quite a large way. So Anchorage was 120,000, Fairbanks 45,000, and both continued to grow apace through the 80s, 90s, 2000s. But the Mat-Su borough, shown in green, which was about 6,000 people in 1970 and ranked about 8th or 9th, has steadily gone up the charts. They were 5th by 1980, 4th by 1990, 3rd by 2000. And in 2010, Fairbanks was still the second largest borough by about 9,000 people, but both Fairbanks and Anchorage as well declined slightly in population, while Mat-Su continued to grow during the 2010s. So by our estimate, in about 2015, Mat-Su passed Fairbanks to become the second largest borough, and that was confirmed in the 2020 census, where Mat-Su is about 11,500 more people than the Fairbanks North Star borough, but still a long way to go to catch Anchorage. Next slide.
Eric, I just wanted to pause here before we go on. I saw something fun, I think yesterday, about how Fairbanks passed Juneau again. So this is data by borough, but by city, Fairbanks just barely jumped ahead of Juneau as the second largest city. So a little bit of consolation.
The red shows the Fairbanks North Star borough, which anyone in Fairbanks tells you is very different from the population of the city. Yeah, the city of Fairbanks is about 32,000 people, and it grew. We saw that Fort Wainwright growth. The city population grew by about 900 people, about 900 people during the 2010s. So it's still ahead of Juneau as the second largest city. So the city of Fairbanks is still number 2.
And Mat-Su's kind of fun because for all their growth, they don't have much in the way of cities. Like we think of Palmer as an exception, Wasilla, but they're quite small. It's the unincorporated parts of Mat-Su that are grown a lot. But okay, I'll shut up now.
Yep.
Back to you.
No problem. So thinking about how much of Alaska's total population the Fairbanks North Star borough takes up, and despite losing its number 2 position, it's still about the same percentage of Alaska's state's population as it has been in recent decades. This graph shows the proportion of the state's population within each of the 5 major boroughs. So the Anchorage, Mat-Su, Fairbanks, Kenai and Juneau, and with yellow for the rest of Alaska. And the 5 major boroughs have gone from about 69% of the population to 80% of the population over a period of 50 years. But as you can see, Fairbanks has kind of bounced between 13 and 15% of the population. So it generally suggests it has been growing about at the same rate as the state as a whole. It's dropped with the population loss in the 2010s, it dropped to 13% of the population, but that's about exactly the same percentage it was in 2000 and 1980. So it's, even though lost the number 2 spot, it still hasn't really lost ground that much as a whole. But as you can see, Matsu in the green, in contrast, it went from 2% up to 15%, and the Anchorage and the rest of Alaska are steadily losing their proportion as well. They're not as much as they used to be. So that's all I have on that, Dan.
Thanks, Eric. So we're going to move back to Liz, but I wanted to just mention as a little bit of an introduction to the next couple of slides that when you look, plenty of people on this call know far more about the details of Fairbanks population dynamics and trend and economy, what drives things. But looking at Fairbanks from a kind of a comparison data eye, the things that stand out to me consistently are how important the military and the university are to your economy. They both play an outsized role in some of the, job numbers, but population numbers, military and dependence, some of those things. So I wanted to just mention that before turning it back over to Liz.
Thanks. I was curious to see whether UAF enrollment was up or down. So what do you think? True or false? UAF enrollment is down.
We'll ask you to scan your answers later. You won't have to fax them or sign them or anything, but you just scan them and send them to us.
Well, Dan, you can go ahead and reveal the answer. It's true. Now, this data I got from the University of Alaska. So this is not a data set that we maintain or collect, but I was just curious to see what the enrollment trends were at UAF. So I found the head count at the Fairbanks campus over time. And I thought it was an interesting pattern. You can see there's generally between 5,000 and 6,000 people going to school at the Fairbanks campus. And if anybody from the university is on today, it'd be interesting if you have any elaboration to this. Dan, next slide, please. So I also looked at Alaskans age 15 to 24, thinking this would be the main market for UAF services, college programs, to see what the trend in the size of that population is. And you can see that the population of 15 to 24-year-olds peaked in 2007 and then has been slowly declining since then. I don't have anything else to add to this, but maybe Dan has something.
Well, I was just going to say, Liz, that this kind of is a good hint at what's to come. What's to come. And one thing I will mention is part of what's been going on for Alaska that is changing things in important ways, including, in this chart, the number of people, the rough count of people who are potential enrollees in UAF. But the number of people of working age has been declining. And the reason for that is that the unusually large baby boomer population are aging out. of typical working ages. So part of the relevance of that is even as COVID has created this at least temporary reluctance for people to go back to work, there's behind that trend and predating COVID, there was a declining number of Alaskans of working age. And Liz has given you one slice of it here, this 15 to 24, but moving on to the next question and back to Eric, we're going to look at another chunk of the age group.
All right, thanks, Dan. The question here is the number of kids, true or false, the number of kids in the Fairbanks North Star Borough is growing. Now, kids, we mean 0 to 17, so the population under 18. And give a minute, and then false. And this is, go to the next slide. This is actually not a unique Fairbanks issue. In between 2010 and 2020, the number of kids in the state as a whole dropped as well. So down from about 187,000 to 179,000, a 4.2% drop. And Fairbanks's number again are up on the right side. In between 2010 and 2020, the Fairbanks number of kids in the Fairbanks North Star Borough dropped from about 25,000 to just under 23,000, which is a pattern we see all over the state. All of the interior, plus Anchorage, Kenai, Juneau, Ketchikan, Sitka, large portions of the state have fewer kids than they did a decade ago. And there are multiple reasons for this, one of which is there's been a slowing, the number of births has steadily slowed during the decade. Our fertility rates have dropped. The number of births we see in a year have declined by about 10% or so. And part of that was just during the recession in the second half, was when we really saw births decline. And another reason is we've seen large out-migration of working age people, and they take their families with them. So the migration numbers for kids has been negative, and that has led to declining enrollments and a drop in the number of kids statewide and within the Fairbanks North Star Borough. Next slide. Now, it's interesting that the number of kids steadily declining is actually not that new of a phenomenon. This graph shows in Alaska blue, the Fairbanks North Star Borough in dark red, and the rest of the interior. So the Southeast Fairbanks census area, Denali Borough, and Yukon Koyukuk census area. The change over time in kid population, 0 to 17, with the year 1980 set to 100%. So if you go from 100 to 110, that would mean that the population grew 10%. And the reason we put this chart this way is just there's wildly different total values. So we want them to be visible on one chart than between Alaska and the Fairbanks Borough. But early in the 80s, there was a massive baby boom, lots of in-migration to Alaska, and the number of kids shot up very high. So the Fairbanks North Star Borough there are a number of kids between about 1980 and the early 90s grew by over 50%, but then started to peak at about 1993, which is still the peak year for the Fairbanks North Star Borough for a number of kids. And after that, Eielson started to decline, and then some of the kids born in the 80s started to age out of the demographic. So both Fairbanks and the state as a whole peaked in the 90s and steadily declined through the 2000s, mostly just a demographic change in generations. But after about 2009, both Fairbanks and the state of Alaska as a whole were steadily growing in the number of kids. It looked like they might pass the early 90s numbers, but starting in about 2015, the recession hit, the net migration numbers turned starkly negative for people in their 30s, and that included a lot of parents. So net migration turned negative for kids as well. So you see both the state as a whole dropped and Fairbanks dropped steadily in the number of kids after 2016 or so. Although one thing to note is this was not census data, this was our estimates, and we estimated the Fairbanks North Star Borough having a slight uptick between 2019 and 2020. So it could be that things are already turning around, but for the rest of the interior, it's been a very steady decline, over 40% since the late 80s, and a lot of that, some of it was closing of bases such as Fort Greely, or Fort Greely didn't close, but it's much reduced in population. And then part of it is migration of families with school-age kids to the Fairbanks North Star Borough for better schooling. But part of it is just the population in the rural interior has gotten steadily older. The median ages are higher in the rural interior than in the Fairbanks North Star Borough, and that leads to fewer kids. All right, that's all I got, Dan.
Eric, so I mentioned that university and military, so we're going to go back to Liz now for this question number 8.
Thanks. I also just wanted to plug our recent trends article that it's in the December trends, which was just released yesterday. We write a little bit more about the change in Alaska's child population in that article. So I was curious about trends in the size of the active duty military in Fairbanks. So what do you think? Active duty military numbers are up in the borough. Yes, so the data on this chart show you the counts over time, and I want to recognize our partners in the military who supply counts every year for our population estimates program. So we survey military installations across the state every year to find out the numbers on each one. And that's how we are able to get these numbers for Fairbanks, North Star Borough over time. So you can see pretty flat active duty military numbers for the 2010s, but then our survey picked up a small growth in the active duty military numbers for the Fairbanks North Star Borough in the summer of 2020. And Eric talked a little bit about this earlier. It wasn't reflected in the decennial census numbers, but the timing of our survey is slightly different. And so we did detect a slight increase in 2020.
Thanks, Liz. And thanks for mentioning trends. Liz and Eric and David Howell combined on a fairly extensive article on what data has come out so far on the 2020 census. So if you haven't seen that, take a look. And I also wanted to mention the military, the numbers from the military are not part of our standard employment data set. So when we do a monthly press release where we talk about the unemployment rate and the job numbers. And sometimes we get a little bit lost in thinking that what we report on regularly is all there is. But the military is one example of a big, important economic force that's outside of these standard data sets that we report on. Self-employment is another one, and commercial fishing is a big part of that. Commercial fishing, people who actually do the fishing are not paid a wage and salary, and for some other reasons, they're not part of our standard data sets. So we remind ourselves, hopefully often enough, to when we talk to people, to point out what is not part of the data that they see most frequently from us. And the military is a really important part, as I've said. So moving to question number 9, true or false, and I hope this one's a little bit hard for you. Oil and gas jobs are at the lowest they've been since the early 1980s in Alaska, and less than half what they were a few years ago. So you have to, most of you, some of you I know, most of you I don't. You have to kind of guess it. Am I exaggerating some of these? Am I trying to trick you here? Is it possible that we've lost more than half of our oil and gas jobs in just a few years? So I might have just tipped my psychological hand there. True, that is true. So we've heard about oil and gas's losses, but every time we look at this, we're a little, sobered. It's the change is really large. And I'll just mention, in a couple of weeks, this distinguished UAF alumnus Neil Fried, along with Karina Wiebold and Sarah Teal, three of our economists, are going to talk a little bit more about oil and gas and inflation and some of the other interesting things going on economically. So this is a little bit of a tease for what I think Neil in particular will talk a little more about, Neil and Karina, about actually all three of those economists has some special insights. Sarah Teal, who will talk to you, has experience working in the oil and gas industry, which we always love as a way to learn a little bit more. But so looking at oil and gas jobs over this 2001 to current time period, a couple of things I wanted to point out with this chart is how steep the losses were pre-COVID. So if you're familiar at all with what's been happening in oil and gas, you know that prices were especially high earlier in the 2010 period. We had a nice run up, in fact, all-time highs. We were above 15,000 total oil and gas jobs. And I'll just mention in passing, a little nuance in what's counted as an oil and gas job. They're service jobs, they're construction jobs that are obviously related to oil and gas. So again, don't get too hung up in those details, but we'd be glad to answer any questions if people have them. But so what you see from that above 15,000. Yes.
Gina Tran has her hand up.
Okay, let's hear Gina's question.
How many of those lost jobs are actually to workers that live out of state?
I love that question, Gina. Thank you for that, because I wouldn't have otherwise given this number. And I also wanted to mention, as a bit of an intro to that, Alaska's especially data rich. And the short answer for why, there's another answer too, but the permanent fund dividend gives us the ability to do a lot of things, including answer this type of question. So as using the permanent fund dividend criteria for residency, which is a good one. It takes a while to become an Alaska resident. As you know, by that standard, you have to live here for a full calendar year. But roughly 30% of oil and gas jobs, oil and gas workers, are non-residents. And they're true non-residents, most of them. In some industries, we're just some of what we capture is new residents because of that lag in the data. But these oil and gas workers, we're quite sure, are disproportionately people who really do fly in, work in Alaska for 2 weeks, fly somewhere else where they live. So that's an important point, that as we measure the economic impact of job loss, current, past, future, we should kind of keep in mind that about 70% of these jobs are held by Alaska residents. And another thing, and I'll just make a little mention of this annual report we do that we're working on right now that quantifies in a lot of detail by industry, by area, the number of non-residents. And a lot of the oil and gas workers, Fairbanks has a fair number. Everybody who goes to the slope to work is commuting from somewhere. Fairbanks has a fair number. Matsu has a big number. Anchorage has a big number. Southeast has almost none. But the benefit of these jobs, to the extent they're held by Alaskans, is spread throughout, especially the rail belt. So thank you for that good question, Gina. And so notice.
And we have another person with their hand up. I apologize.
Yeah, let's go to that. Will, it looks like, right?
Yes.
Yeah, just real quick, is that big drop in 2019 or 2020, is that associated with the change in lease from BP to Hillcorp?
Another good question. Thanks for that, Will. So a small part of it would be the leaner Hillcorp staffing. And that gives me a chance to point out these are oil and gas jobs throughout the state. So there's a little bit of Cook Inlet in there. Most of it is North Slope. And I mentioned that partly because BP had some Anchorage white collar jobs, some executives that Hillcorp has fewer of. And Hillcorp, we've heard, is a little leaner as a company. I think we've seen it in the data. But some of that, although that would be a little bit earlier than that, I think, and Neil can talk a little bit more about that in a couple of weeks, but most of that big drop in early 2020 was pure COVID. And on that point, there has been, and this is important, there's been very little bounce so far. We don't know yet what that means. We've heard the activity starting to pick up. There's lots of information, but oil prices generally drive a little bit of an increase, but there are big questions about the future of oil and gas in Alaska. And I hope we're not ostriches burying our heads in the sand about this, because it matters, and understanding what's driving it matters. On that point, I wanted to just kind of mention this slide. This is just oil and gas extraction, which is a subset of total oil and gas jobs. But notice not quite the same pattern. I included 0 on both of these charts because compare our numbers. Well, I guess not that much more extreme. It's the same basic shape. So this is essentially the same time period. But the US oil and gas jobs have also taken a pretty, precipitous, a big percent dip since their peak at that high oil price period, early 2014, 2015. But they didn't take nearly as much of a drop because of COVID, but also kind of leveling off, and it's not clear where they're going. One of the points I wanted to, one of the thoughts that came to mind as I was putting this chart together was just that to listen to political speakers, you would think that it makes a huge difference whether we have a Democrat or a Republican in the White House, or a Democrat or a Republican in the governor's house here in Juneau. These data sets, oil and gas job numbers, unemployment rates, they're far less driven by political factors than people might think hearing those very loud conversations. And that gives me a chance to point out, to mention, we are nonpartisan here. We tell the Republican governor the same thing we tell a Democrat governor. And it's important for that to be a bright line. It doesn't matter to us what a governor hopes the numbers will be for population or something else. It's critical that we tell them with full objectivity what we believe they will be based on data factors. But do take note of that political actors generally get too much blame and too much credit for what drives these big big data sets. So oil production would be one, oil and gas jobs. I mentioned some of the others. Gross domestic product would be another one. It's tempting to look for political factors, but most of the time, and I don't mean to say that political factors don't matter. Permitting, some of those things that we've heard a lot about, they do matter, but they don't matter over a short time period. And I could show you a handful of graphs that you could not identify the change in administrations by what moves these large data sets. And I think that is my last slide. And we have, it looks like a little bit of time. I'll let Stephanie jump in when we're out of time. But any of the three of us would love to answer any questions you have for the next few minutes.
Will, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, so you showed declines kind of all across the board. Is there any major cause that is driving these? Is it cost of living that's driving the movements and the lower birth rate and all of that? How does that compare with the rest of the country? And is there anything we can do as a state to try to remedy that?
So Will, which graph are you talking about?
Well, just about all the questions, you had showed declines in some way, either shrinking population or outmigrating population. And so I'm just wondering, especially for the borough, compared to these other boroughs that have seen population growth, is there a big difference between, what's happened? Is it just temperature, that Fairbanks is cold and people prefer Matsu because it's not as cold and it's cheaper to live there? Or is there something else at play?
It's a fun question. So we talk here partly because we have people who work primarily on jobs and we have people who work primarily on population, whether jobs drive population growth or population growth drives employment growth. And the answer is both. So think of places like the states that are growing the most right now are disproportionately warm weather states. That's something that we talk about in this article that we talked about in trends that just came out. So baby boomers understandably kind of look for warm weather places for their old bones. Alaska's population has generally shallower roots. So that's a little bit part of it, that we've got this big group of people entering an age when they might want to live somewhere warmer. But oils and Alaska's political uncertainty is also part of what we need to solve to kind of give ourselves the best chance at stability and growth. We've had an unusual amount of political instability over the last 5 or 6 years as we've wrestled with this whole issue with oil and gas and loss of revenue, blah, blah. And we don't need to overstate that, but that is part of what's going on. And then just underneath that, oil and gas, that decline. And Liz or Eric, anything to add on that question?
No, not particularly. I mean, basically, it wasn't just Fairbanks that had a rough decade population-wise. It was Anchorage too, and much of the state. And yeah, it was a lot of out-migration. For much of the second half of the decade, the economy was doing much better outside than it was in Alaska, and then just the lower birth rates. That is partly economic, but partly too just kind of a generational change. The large echo boomers, so children of the boomers, are now reaching late 30s, and that causes decline in number of births as well. But as we noted, there were some positive signs for Fairbanks. The F-35s, we saw jump in the number of kids as well. So keep an eye out for what the 2021 population estimates show, which will be out in January.
Thanks, Eric. I see a couple more questions. Stephanie, you want to unmute people in the order that makes sense to you?
Yes, Mike Prax, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, this is Barbara Haney, staff from Mike Cox. I'm kind of curious, as I look at these numbers, I haven't seen very much that breaks out gender and age. I mean, you've done a little bit with the children on breaking that out, but I'm kind of curious about gender. If you've made any effort to break out the in-migration and out-migration numbers, particularly. It seems to me if we're going to be worried about fertility rates, clearly the mix of genders that are coming in and out of the state is going to be relevant to fertility rates. I mean, I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that fertility is largely contingent on your female population. At least
True.
it's been my historical experience. So I'm just wondering if there's been any effort to kind of tease out that in and out migration based on gender. Historically, there's been this thing of girls who grow up in this town marry GIs, move out, but then again, women move in because they're attached to a GI or a, service member. And other instances like myself, I came up here as a single woman and here I am still a single woman. So, I mean, that sort of thing, not all women are attached to a military duffel bag. That's why I was kind of curious if there's been much to tease that out.
Yeah, that's a good question. And Eric, why don't you fill in some of the blanks there and mention what data we have?
Yes, we did actually. In our March 2021 Alaska Economic Trends, we looked at migration by age, and one of the reasons we broke out also by gender to see, well, do men and women have different migration patterns in Alaska? And what we found was basically not particularly. Men are more likely to move both in and out, especially at younger working ages, so between 20 and 50. But when we looked at the net migration numbers, the men and women generally mirror each other. Women moving in and out less are a slightly smaller number, but when men are moving to Alaska, women are moving to Alaska as well. When men are leaving Alaska, women are leaving Alaska as well. And we also have looked at the population. We have data on the sex ratio, so the number of men per women in Alaska, which is always a number that gets some press. The ADN wrote about it a couple weeks ago, and basically Alaska is still more men than women. It was about 106 in the 2010 census. The 2020 census results on sex have not been released yet. That'll be sometime next year, but generally the population is growing. The number of women as a percentage of the population has been growing. So as to the declining fertility rates, I mean, fertility rates are interesting because it looks at not just women, but women of childbearing years, and the number of children born to women of childbearing years has been dropping, meaning they could have kids, but they're choosing not to in some cases. So it could, as we think, might just be economic distress.
Okay, we have one more question with Todd. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, so it was anecdotal, but it seems most of the people I'm flying in or out of Alaska, oil workers were previous residents of Alaska, and they've chosen to move out over the last decade. Is there any tax policy that was that you can tie towards that immigration out of that workforce and those jobs? They still have the same jobs. They just left the state.
Yeah, so I didn't hear really well, but I think I heard the first part, and you're right that a lot of the non-resident Alaska oil and gas workers were previous Alaska residents. And we have done a little bit of work on that because with the PFD data, we know who used to be an Alaska resident. So sometimes Alaska gets caught up in saying those non-residents keep taking our jobs. And there are various problems with that, although underneath it's smart to be thinking about to what extent Alaska is benefiting from those high wage jobs. But to some degree, oil and gas workers who used to live here now move outside. So yes, that happens. And we have done a little bit on that. And I would be happy to talk more. We can talk through email.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. That was a great discussion. This session was recorded and it can be found on the FNSB Community Research Quarterly website. Our next session is on Wednesday, December 8th. We look forward to seeing you then, and thank you for joining us today.